There's a sentence that follows money around the world, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The line is usually credited to Andrew Carnegie. It appears nowhere in his writings. What actually kills those fortunes is not what you were told. It is not lazy grandchildren, and it is not champagne and yachts. It is 4 things, and every one of them is structural. Arithmetic, an asset that cannot be cut, a deadline nobody in the family chose, and a room where no one holds the deciding vote. By the end of this, you will know all 4, and what the families who lasted centuries built instead. Start with how old that fear is. In Lancashire, they said it with clogs. In Japan, they said it with rice paddies. In China, they said simply that wealth does not last beyond 3 generations. Nobody coordinated that, and the number everyone repeats beside it has a problem of its own. 70% of wealthy families lose the money by the 2nd generation, 90% by the 3rd. In 2022, a critique published in a specialist journal for family offices took that figure apart, and its title was blunt: "There is no 70% rule." The CFA Institute went further. In its own words, there is no solid evidence that the pattern is widespread at all. So the proverb cannot be sourced, the statistic is contested, and yet great fortunes keep dying. Let me show you what they won't. Start with the statistic, because almost everything the internet believes about generational wealth rests on it. The source is a 20-year study by an American family wealth consultancy called the Williams Group, covering more than 3,000 wealthy families. Its finding is the one you have heard 100 times. 70% of those families lose control of the wealth in the 2nd generation, and 90% lose it by the 3rd. You will see it quoted in headlines, in seminars, in the opening minute of 1,000 videos. It has become the closest thing this subject has to a law of physics. Quick ask before we go further. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps, and there is a great deal more of this world to show you. Now, that study has been challenged in print. In June of 2022, a family wealth researcher named James Grubman published a critique in the International Family Offices Journal under a title that leaves very little room for interpretation: "There is no 70% rule." His argument was not that families never lose money. His argument was that the famous figure traces back to a single study from the 1980s, narrow in its sample, narrow in the industry it looked at, narrow in the geography it covered, and that it systematically underreported the families whose transitions went quietly and well. Think about why that would happen, because the bias is almost charming in its obviousness. A family that fractures, sues, and sells makes a story. A family that hands over a business on a Tuesday with the paperwork already signed makes no story at all. Nobody writes it down, nobody studies it. The disasters are visible and the successes are invisible. And if you count only what you can see, you will conclude that everything ends badly. And the CFA Institute, about as far from a tabloid as an institution can get, published its own assessment of the 3rd generation curse. Its conclusion was that much of the evidence for wealth eroding across generations derives from one flawed study: that there is no solid proof the pattern is general, and that there are in fact many families who preserved and grew their wealth across many generations. So why does the myth survive? Because the fear underneath it is real and old. Look again at how many languages built their own version. Clogs to clogs in the north of England, rice paddies to rice paddies in Japan, 3 generations in China. Nobody coordinated that. It is not statistics. It is human beings in completely separate centuries watching the same thing happen often enough to give it a name. But here is the detail almost nobody quotes, and it is the most useful sentence the Williams Group ever produced. When they examined why the transitions failed, the leading cause was not spending. It was not stupidity. It was not even bad investing. In roughly 60% of the failures, the cause was a breakdown in communication and trust inside the family. A further quarter came down to a lack of effective planning. Read that again because it quietly demolishes the moral version of this story. The study that everyone cites to prove heirs are weak actually reports that families fail because they could not talk to one another and never built a plan. Those are not character flaws, those are missing structures. which means the interesting question was never whether the grandchildren are worthy. That question is comfortable and it is useless. It lets everyone at the table believe that their own children will be the exception. The mechanical question is far less flattering and far more predictive. What exactly happens to a large fortune, structurally, between one funeral and the next? Where does the money physically go? It goes into more hands. And that, before anything else, before taxes, before lawyers, before a single bad decision gets made, is where the trouble begins. Watch what happens to ownership itself, because the first component of this machine is not a human failing at all. It is arithmetic. A fortune has one thing working against it that a business does not. A business can hire. A family can only multiply. Think about the arithmetic in the abstract for a moment. And I want to be clear that this is an illustration of the math, not the record of any one family. One founder builds something. He has 3 children, so one owner becomes 3. Those 3 have 3 each, and now 9 people own what one person built. Their children make 27. Their children make 81. Nothing has been wasted. Nobody has gambled. No yacht has been purchased. And yet the fortune that once answered to a single will now answers to 81 opinions, spread across 4 households in the founder's lifetime, and dozens by the time his name is only a portrait. Now watch what that looks like in the real world, in families that are very much still standing. The DuPonts began in 1802, when Eleuthère Irénée DuPont built a gunpowder mill on the Brandywine River in Delaware. Forbes still ranks them among the richest families in America. In its profile, updated in June of 2026, it put the family fortune at $22 billion and noted that the family is now in its 9th generation. A 7th generation member sits on the board of the company and runs the family's charitable foundation. Sit with those numbers a moment. 9 generations, more than 2 centuries, $22 billion, and a descendant still in the boardroom of the enterprise his ancestors started with gunpowder. By the popular version of the curse, this family should have evaporated 6 generations ago. It did not. But look closer at the shape of it, because the shape is the lesson. By a Forbes estimate from 2016, the DuPont family included more than 3,500 living relatives, with the fortune then valued at around $14.3 billion. Divide a fortune of that size across a crowd of that size, and every individual share becomes something merely comfortable, even while the total remains historic. The name is still enormous. No single person carrying it is. That is the first thing this machine does, and it is the part almost nobody explains. Large fortunes usually do not vanish. They fragment. The money is still there, spread across hundreds of cousins and dozens of branches, sitting in trusts and holdings that were drafted before anyone currently alive was born, and not one of those cousins can move it alone. So when people say a family lost everything in the 3rd generation, what happened in a great many cases was not that the wealth disappeared. It is that the ability to act as one owner disappeared. What dies is the control. 2 European families show what that same fragmentation looks like when it is managed deliberately instead of by accident. In France, the Association Familiale Moulier binds together more than 1,000 family shareholders behind the retail empire the family built. Its governing principle has a name: all in everything, a cross-shareholding model in which the family holds together and no outside investor is admitted at all. 1,000 owners, 1 structure, 0 strangers. And then there is Wendell. On the 8th of May, 1704, a former officer of Louis XIV named Jean-Martin Wendell bought a forge called the Rodolphe in Hayange in Lorraine. That single purchase became a steel dynasty that ran through 11 generations. Today, more than 1,000 members of the Wendell family are represented in the holding company that owns part of the group, more than 3 centuries after that forge changed hands. So 1,000 relatives can share an empire without destroying it, which tells you something important. The number of owners is not, by itself, the problem. Families have solved for 1,000. The problem is what those 1,000 owners are being asked to divide. Because a great fortune is almost never a pile of coins to be counted out on a table. It is usually one thing, one company, one estate, one collection. And that sounds like a technicality. It isn't. It is the second component of the machine, and it is the one that turns harmless arithmetic into damage. Here is the part nobody explains. You can divide money. You cannot divide a machine. Go back to that forge in Hayange. By 1834, the Wendell Enterprise was the 9th largest company in France by production. By 1870, it was the first. And as late as 1975, it was producing 72% of all the raw steel made in France. Now imagine trying to hand something like that to 1,000 descendants the way you would hand out cash. You cannot cut a steelworks into 1,000 pieces and expect 1,000 working steelworks. You get scrap metal and a lawsuit. This is the quiet violence inside inheritance, and it operates far below the scale of national industry. An operating business, a working farm, a building that has been in the family since before anyone alive remembers, these are single, indivisible things. Their value comes precisely from being whole, from the fact that the parts are attached to each other and pointed in the same direction. Split them physically, and the value does not divide, it evaporates. Split them legally into fractions of ownership, and you have not divided the asset at all. You have divided the authority over it. And fractions of authority behave nothing like fractions of money. If 10 heirs each receive $100,000, then each of them has $100,000. 10 independent people, 10 independent lives. But if 10 heirs each receive 10% of a company, none of them has a company. Each has a claim, a vote, and an opinion, and no ability whatsoever to act. They are not 10 owners. They are one owner with 10 heads, and the heads have to agree before the hands can move. There is one further property of these assets that matters more than any other, and I need you to hold on to a single word because it is coming back before the end. The word is liquidity. It sounds like accountancy. It sounds like the least interesting word in this entire story. It is the most expensive word in it. Liquidity simply means how fast a thing becomes cash without losing its value. Publicly traded shares are liquid. You can sell them this afternoon at a price printed on a screen. A closely held family company is not liquid at all. There is no market open at 3 o'clock where you can sell 19% of a family firm at a fair price. To turn that stake into money, somebody has to find a buyer who wants a minority position with no control, negotiate a price, open the books to a stranger, and then argue about what the whole enterprise is really worth. That is a process measured in months and years, not hours. And every day of it is a day when the seller is the one who needs the deal. So picture the position the second and third generations actually inherit. They own something enormous. They own it together. It cannot be physically divided without being destroyed. It cannot be quickly sold without being discounted. And each of them holds a piece of the decision, while none of them holds the decision itself. Notice that nothing has gone wrong yet. There is no villain in this room. Every person at that table could be intelligent, disciplined, and grateful for what they were given. The structure alone, with no help from human weakness, has already made 3 things nearly inevitable. Someone will eventually want out, someone will eventually need cash, and at some point, the family will have to agree on a price for a thing that has never had a price tag. So remember the word, liquidity. It looks like a technical detail sitting quietly in the corner of this story, the kind of thing you would let an accountant handle. Later in this video, I am going to show you a deadline written into American law that turns that one word into the most dangerous thing a great fortune can be missing. And then I am going to show you a rescue clause, buried in the tax code, that exists for no other reason than that this exact failure happens often enough to be worth legislating for. But before any deadline arrives, something simpler takes fortunes apart. The family gets the chance to decide and discovers that it cannot. In 2007, one of the most respected families in American business was handed a decision. They had everything required to make it. They had control, they had lawyers, they had a century of tradition, and they had a legal architecture built specifically to keep the thing they owned. What they did not have was a way to decide. The Bancroft family had owned Dow Jones, and with it, the Wall Street Journal, for more than 100 years. Their control was not sentimental, it was engineered. They held a special class of voting stock designed to make the family's word final, no matter what the wider market wanted. On paper, they were unassailable. In practice, paper is only as strong as the agreement behind it. Then Rupert Murdoch made an offer, and the family split down the middle. By that point, the owners were largely 4th and 5th generation, spread across 3 main branches, and by most accounts, about 30 family members shared the fortune. The younger heirs wanted liquidity, a perfectly reasonable thing to want when your inheritance is a newspaper you cannot spend. Others regarded selling as unthinkable, a betrayal of something that was never theirs to sell in the first place. Both positions were defensible. That was the problem. and the careful network of trusts and control mechanisms the family had built to guarantee that this day could never arrive did not hold up when the day arrived. News Corporation paid $5.6 billion for the Dow Jones assets. By the end of the process, it was the only bidder left standing. Sit with that, because it breaks the story you have been told about families like this. Nobody here gambled the money away. Nobody drank it. There was no fool at the center of this, and no scandal. There was a family that owned a crown jewel, wanted to keep it, held the votes required to keep it, and could not produce a single answer, because 30 people with equal standing and opposite convictions is not a decision-making body. It is a tie. And a tie, in front of a live offer, is not neutral. A tie is a sale. When a family cannot decide, the decision does not politely wait. It migrates to whoever is willing to be decisive, and that person is almost always outside the family. The second version of this failure is slower and quieter, and you can read it in the public record. Consider what had happened to one of the great American brewing dynasties by 2008. A filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission that August recorded that the directors and executive officers of Anheuser-Busch held, in the aggregate, about 4.22% of the company's common stock. Read that carefully, not the family alone. The entire board and the entire executive team, added together, held roughly 4% of the enterprise that carried the family name on every bottle. At that level, ownership is a feeling rather than a power. Legally, the outcome was already decided. It simply had not been announced yet. In November of 2008, shareholders approved the combination with InBev at $70 a share in cash. The decision belonged to the market, because by then the market was who owned it. Two different families, one identical structural failure. In the first, 30 owners with equal rights and no tiebreaker. In the second, a name on the building and 4% of the votes. Neither family ran out of money. Both ran out of authority. And authority, not money, is what actually gets inherited. So this is the third component, and it is the one that has nothing to do with wealth at all. Equal rights plus opposite views plus no rule for breaking a deadlock equals paralysis. Notice that paralysis feels like peace right up until it is tested. For years, nobody has to know that the family has no procedure, because for years, nobody asks it a question that requires one. But while a family argues about whether to sell, a clock is already running that nobody in that room set, in a language none of them chose. It has a date, it has a rate, and it has no interest whatsoever in family sentiment. Every transfer of great wealth in the United States eventually runs into the same appointment, and it is not with a family member. It is with the federal estate tax. The current shape of it was set by legislation signed on the 4th of July, 2025. Beginning in 2026, the federal estate and gift tax exemption stands at $15 million per person, $30 million for a married couple, and unlike the rules it replaced, this one does not expire. The previous version was written with a sunset date built in. This one is permanent and indexed to inflation from 2027 onward, using 2025 as its base year. Above that threshold, the top federal rate is 40%. Now put that beside what you learned 2 chapters ago. The tax is assessed on value. It is paid in cash. And the thing the family owns is a closely held business that cannot be sold this afternoon at a fair price. That is the collision, and it is worth naming precisely because it is not a matter of rates. An illiquid asset has met a liquid obligation. Where a large estate is concentrated in a private company, heirs can face a bill they cannot pay out of pocket, calculated against an asset they cannot quickly convert. Their options narrow to 2. Borrow against the thing, or sell a piece of it. And a sale under a tax deadline is never a sale on your terms. It is a sale on someone else's clock, conducted in a room where every buyer knows exactly how little time you have. Any negotiator will tell you what that does to a price. So now you can see what that word was doing, sitting quietly in the corner of this story. Liquidity, not a technical detail. It is the difference between choosing when you sell and being told when you sell. And here's the proof that this is a structural failure rather than a moral one, the part that genuinely surprised me when I found it. The rescue is written into the tax code itself. It is section 6166 of the Internal Revenue Code, and it exists for precisely this scenario. If the interest in a closely held business amounts to more than 35% of the adjusted gross estate, the executor may elect to stretch the estate tax attributable to that business across as long as 14 years. The design of the relief tells you how well the drafters understood the trap. Up to 5 years of interest-only payments first, then 10 annual installments of principal and interest, and on the first slice of the deferred tax, a deliberately subsidized interest rate of 2%. To qualify, the decedent has to have been a citizen or resident of the United States. The election has to be made on a timely filed federal estate tax return, and the company has to be a genuine operating business rather than a passive holding vehicle. Stop and consider what the existence of that section means. A legislature wrote a 14-year lifeline at a subsidized rate with a 5-year grace period for one specific catastrophe: families being forced to sell productive businesses in order to pay a tax bill. Nobody legislates for a rare accident. You legislate for a pattern, and the fact that the relief has conditions, thresholds, and paperwork means somebody, at some point, sat down and studied the pattern closely enough to draw a line around it. So the fourth component is not greed, and it is not tax rates in themselves. It is a timing mismatch. Wealth held inside a family business is measured in decades. The obligation triggered by a single death is measured in months. Every generation that inherits something indivisible inherits that mismatch along with it, whether or not anyone at the table understands it. And the generation most likely not to understand it is the one that did not build the thing. 4 components then: multiplying owners, an asset that cannot be cut, a deadline that demands cash, and a room with no tiebreaker. And here's the strange part. Not one of those 4, taken alone, has ever destroyed a great fortune. What destroys fortunes is the way they combine, and that combination has a shape, which almost nobody bothers to draw. So let us assemble the machine. Here is the mechanism. Not laziness, not decadence, not bad luck, not bad markets, not even bad heirs. Strike all of it from the record. Assume the best family you can imagine. Hardworking, sober, loyal, financially literate, genuinely fond of one another. Give that family the 4 components anyway, and watch what the machine does to them. Generation 1 owns one thing and makes every decision alone. There is no governance problem in a household of one, which is exactly why founders so rarely build one. Generation 2 owns the same one thing in pieces, and every decision now requires agreement. But they grew up in the same house, at the same table, hearing the same stories, so agreement is usually cheap. Generation 3 owns fractions of fractions, and by now agreement is a negotiation between people who grew up in different houses, in different cities, with different ideas about what the family is even for. The asset has not changed. The number of hands on it has, and so has the distance between those hands. Then the machine simply waits. It is patient in a way no person can be. It waits for the moment every family eventually reaches: a death, a divorce, an illness, a cousin who wants to start something of his own, a tax bill that arrives with a date printed on it. And in that moment, it asks the family a single question. It is the only question it ever asks. Who decides? If there is an answer, a document, a trustee, a council, a formula, a rule agreed to years earlier by people who were not yet angry, then the family absorbs the shock and keeps going. The shock still hurts. It just does not break anything structural. If there is no answer, the question does not politely withdraw. It gets answered by somebody else, by a court, by a buyer, by an auction, by whoever happens to be holding cash on the day the family runs out of time. That is the entire mechanism. A fortune does not die of character. It dies of arithmetic without procedure. Which is why the popular version of this story is not merely wrong, it is backwards. It tells you that wealth corrupts families. Look at the evidence and the arrow reverses. It is the absence of structure that destroys wealth, and it does so most efficiently in families where everybody means well. Because in those families, nobody thinks a rule is necessary. Rules feel like an insult when you love each other. Why would you draft a document about what happens if your brother and you cannot agree when you have never failed to agree? That is precisely the reason such documents are written by the generation that still gets along. They are not written for the family that exists. They are written for the family that will exist 60 years from now, made of people you will never meet, who will share nothing but your surname and your asset. Think of a fortune as a ship rather than a pile. One hand on the wheel and the ship has a direction, whether or not the direction is wise. 20 hands on the wheel and it has none, and a ship with no direction does not sink dramatically in a storm. That is not how this ends. It drifts, competently crewed and going nowhere, until somebody standing on a dock with a rope decides where it will be tied up. So the question that separates the families who last from the families who become a cautionary tale is not the question everyone asks. It is not how much did they leave. It is not even whether the children were ready. It is colder than that and far more useful. Is there a procedure for when they disagree? Most families cannot answer it, and the ones who can did not answer it with money or with willpower. They answered it with engineering, legal instruments, professional institutions, written constitutions, prices agreed in advance. And some of that engineering is a great deal older than you would expect. It begins, of all places, in a Massachusetts courtroom in 1830, with a university suing a trustee over a loss. Watch what came out of that case, because almost every dollar of American old money still runs on it. John McLean died on the 23rd of October, 1823. In his will, he left $35,000, some personal property, and a house to his wife Anne. And he left $50,000 in trust to two brothers, Jonathan and Francis Amory, with instructions to invest it, in the language of the document, in safe and productive stock, according to their best judgment and discretion. They put the money into incorporated manufacturing and insurance companies, among them the Boston Manufacturing Company. The accounts showed a loss, and Harvard College, along with the Massachusetts Hospital, sued. The case was decided in 1830 by the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, and the opinion, written by Justice Samuel Putnam, produced what is still called the prudent man rule. A trustee, he wrote, should observe how men of prudence, discretion, and intelligence manage their own affairs, not with regard to speculation, but with regard to the permanent disposition of their funds, weighing the probable income as well as the probable safety of the capital to be invested. To understand why that sentence changed everything, you have to know what came before it. Most states operated on what was called the legal list, a fixed roster of government-approved investments, public funds, first mortgages, that a trustee was permitted to touch, and nothing else. Prudence was a list you obeyed. After 1830, prudence became a process you could be judged on. The question stopped being what a trustee invested in and became how he decided. That single shift is what made professional stewardship of family money possible at all. If prudence is a list, a trustee is a clerk. If prudence is judgment, a trustee can be a professional, and a family can hand its capital to someone who is neither a relative nor a bureaucrat and hold him to a standard. Which means the entire apparatus of old money, the trust and the trustee and the discrete institution that carries a fortune across generations that never meet each other, rests on a case that a university won about money it had lost. The second piece of engineering is far more recent and far more aggressive. For centuries, Anglo-American law contained a rule against perpetuities, which forbade trusts from running forever. Wealth had to be released back into the hands of the living eventually. The law's instinct was that the dead should not govern property indefinitely. In 1983, South Dakota became the first state in the Union to abolish that rule, and in doing so created the modern dynasty trust, a trust with no expiry date at all. Understand exactly what that solves, because it maps onto this video with uncomfortable precision. If a trust never terminates, the assets inside it are never forced out into the hands of individual heirs, and if they are never distributed, they are not repeatedly exposed to a taxable transfer at every generation. The multiplying owners problem and the deadline problem are attacked at the same time, not by discipline and not by virtue, but by choice of jurisdiction. A structure that outlives every person inside it, in a state most of the beneficiaries will never visit. The third piece is institutional. In 1882, John D. Rockefeller established what both Deloitte and the Financial Times describe as the first full-service, single-family office in the United States. The distinction is worth drawing out. Other industrialists of that era founded private banks, which existed to serve the family firm. He built an office whose only client was the family itself. The investments, the accounts, the philanthropy, all administered by professional staff, with the assets consolidated under one roof. By the end of the 19th century, that model had imitators, as families like the Mellons and the Phippses assembled professional teams to manage their fortunes once the original business had matured. Boston, in particular, became a quiet capital of this work, where old New England money was administered deliberately out of view. The discretion was not shyness, it was policy. So, a rule of judgment from 1830, a trust with no end date from 1983, and a professional office from 1882. Notice what all three have in common. Not one of them asks an heir to be virtuous. But structure alone is not enough, because structures are still run by people, and people still disagree. The last piece of the engineering is a document, and a document sounds soft. It isn't. It is the only part of all this that speaks directly to the cause the research itself identified. Remember what the Williams Group actually found. In roughly 60% of failed wealth transitions, the cause was a breakdown of communication and trust. A further quarter came down to the absence of effective planning. Whatever you make of the headline statistic, that diagnosis points at something very specific, and it is not the stock market. So the families who take this seriously, write it down. The instrument has a name, the Family Constitution. It is a bespoke document, part corporate mission statement and part charter, and it is being adopted by more and more wealthy families precisely as the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history gets underway. Its purpose is to govern the wealth before there is a conflict to govern, to mitigate disputes in advance, and to carry a set of values forward without relying on anybody's recollection of what grandfather would have wanted. Around that document sits an architecture that looks less like a family and more like a small republic. A mission statement, a family council, which is the working body, a formal family assembly where the wider family is heard, defined roles and responsibilities, communication protocols, and a written succession process, which is, if you have been following, the prepared answer to the machine's only question. Professionals call this institutionalization, and the definition deserves to be heard precisely because it is the opposite of everything the word dynasty makes you picture. It means creating repeatable structures, roles, policies, committees, reporting routines, decision processes. It is the migration from personal control to organizational capability, and it demands something genuinely difficult of the person who built the fortune. The senior generation has to delegate real authority and accept being governed by a process it can no longer overrule. That is the hardest sentence in this video. The founder has to agree to stop being the mechanism. Then there is the piece that handles the exact pressure point we identified earlier, the heir who wants out. The instrument is the buy-sell agreement, and its central purpose in a family business is blunt, to restrict the owner's ability to freely transfer their interests so that an unwanted owner can never appear at the table. It governs the triggering events in advance: death, disability, retirement. And critically, it fixes how the price will be calculated before anybody has a reason to argue about the price. Some families use a fixed value, some an independent appraisal, and many use a formula, a multiple of earnings or book value, or a measure of operating profit. The advantage of a formula is transparency. Two people looking at the same financial statements arrive at the same number, which removes the argument about the process, not just the argument about the outcome. Best practice is to recalculate it every year and tell every shareholder what their stake is worth, so that nobody discovers the value of their own inheritance in the middle of a crisis. Think about what that does to the failure we watched earlier. A relative who needs liquidity no longer has to go looking for an outside buyer because there is already an internal door, with a price on it, agreed years ago by people who were not yet in conflict. The exit stops being a betrayal and becomes a transaction. And the final layer is not legal at all. It is belonging, converted into a rule. The Moulier family's principle is literally all in everything, with no outside investor admitted. In the Wendell family, where more than 1,000 relatives are represented in the holding company, members arriving at a shareholder meeting wear a badge with their name and the family coat of arms, colored by branch, red for Wendell, blue for Curell, green for Gargan. 3 centuries of lineage, 3 colors, and a room where everyone can see at a glance which part of the story they came from. Trusts, offices, constitutions, councils, formulas, badges. It is a great deal of machinery, and I suspect part of you is wondering whether all of it is really necessary, whether a family with enough character could simply skip the paperwork. It is a fair objection, and it is the one I want to end on, because the strongest proof in this entire story is not American, it is not modern, and it used none of these instruments. It is an inn that opened its doors in the year 718. In 718, in a village called Owazu, on the coast of Japan, a family opened a hot spring inn. Its gardens hold thermal baths, fed by the spring itself. It is still open. It is still theirs. 46 generations of the same family have run the Hoshi Ryokan. Not 46 years, 46 generations, which makes it one of the oldest family enterprises on Earth. And there is a detail in its succession that tells you everything about how it survived. The current owner is expected to pass the inn to his daughter, and that will make her the first woman to hold it in 1,305 years. Read that number again, because the lesson is hidden inside it. For 13 centuries, that family had one rule about who takes over. The rule was so absolute, so unquestioned, that changing it now is historic news. Empires rose and fell outside that garden. Currencies were invented and abandoned, and the answer to who decides never once had to be improvised. Or take Florence. In 1385, a man named Giovanni di Piero Antinori joined the Florentine Winemakers Guild. 26 generations of Antinori have made wine since then, in unbroken family hands, which makes it one of the 10 oldest family-owned companies in the world. Neither of these families had a South Dakota dynasty trust. Neither had a family office in 1882, or a constitution drafted by advisors, or a buy-sell formula recalculated every spring. So what did they have? Exactly what all of that machinery is for: one asset, one steward at a time, and one rule about succession that no generation was permitted to renegotiate. That is the answer, and it is almost disappointing in its simplicity. The trust, the office, the council, the formula, none of them are the point. They are what a modern family with 1,000 relatives, an operating company, and a 40% tax rate has to build in order to reproduce what an inn in Owazu achieved with a single, unbroken rule. Now let me turn this around, because it reaches you long before it reaches anyone with a dynasty. You may never own an indivisible asset worth more than a tax exemption, but you will almost certainly share something that matters with people you love. A property, a small business, the care of a parent, a decision about a family home that 3 siblings have 3 different feelings about. And the way you handle your own money runs on the same machine we have just taken apart, not on how much you have, on whether there is a procedure. So the question to carry out of this is not which instrument to buy, and I am not here to tell you to build one. It is quieter than that, and it costs nothing. In the things you already share, who decides when there is no agreement? Have you ever said it out loud, actually said it, to the people it concerns, or does everyone simply assume that goodwill will be enough when the day comes? Goodwill is the thing that fails first, and it always fails at the worst possible moment, because the worst possible moment is precisely when it is being tested. The families who last are not more disciplined than the families who don't. They are not wiser, and their children are not better. They built structures that do not depend on discipline, and then they had the humility to let those structures outrank them. That is the whole secret. It has been sitting in plain view since a courtroom in 1830, and it is still, right now, the least fashionable idea in a world that would rather talk about returns. And notice the shape of every instrument in this video: the rule of judgment, the trust with no end date, the office with one client, the constitution, the council, the price agreed in advance. Every single one of them was built by somebody who accepted in advance that they would not be in the room when it mattered. That is what separates a fortune from a legacy. A fortune is what you hold. A legacy is what still works after you have stopped holding it. If this was worth your time, subscribe. This is the kind of thing we do here. And next, I want to take you inside the room where these decisions actually get made. The private family office, the council, the meeting where a fortune is governed rather than spent. Almost nobody outside those families has ever seen how that room works. God bless you.